Welcome to Lead and Follow, a podcast that explores how great collaboration actually happens. I'm your host, Sharna Fabiano, author of the book Lead and Follow, The Dance of Inspired Teamwork. And I'm pleased to bring you the latest research, insights, and learning methods to help you work together better with the people around you. I help founders, solopreneurs, and new leaders become great at collaborating because I've seen how much more becomes possible when people integrate their ideas, perspectives, and strengths in a practical way. To learn more about coaching with me and for a one-time discount on your first session, go to sharnafabiano.com/coaching and enter the promo code podcast. The link is in the show notes. And now, here's the episode. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Ron Riggio, the Henry R. Kravis Professor of Leadership and Organizational Psychology and former director of the Kravis Leadership Institute at Claremont McKenna College. Ron is a social personality psychologist and leadership scholar with more than 24 authored or edited books and more than 250 articles or book chapters. He was co-editor, along with Ira Chaliff and Jean Lippman-Blumen, of The Art of Followership, and he is the 2025 co-chair of the Global Followership Conference. Ron has both a broad and a deep perspective on the evolution of followership research over the past 2 decades, and I'm really looking forward to hearing his thoughts on where the followership community has been and where it's going, as well as his own current work to expand the research on followership and its relationship to leadership. Ron, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Sharna. I'm glad to be here.
You were involved in the very first conference on followership at Claremont McKenna almost 20 years ago, way back in 2006. And for those who aren't familiar with that history, I would love for us to start today with you sharing just a little bit about how that first came together.
Yeah, it is surprising that it was so long ago. Some of it seems like yesterday, but the roots of that conference actually start a few years earlier when I was at a leadership conference in Nebraska with a bunch of leadership scholars. And we were talking about leadership and leadership. And at some point, a couple of us, Mary Ulbein being one of the people that I remember, said, we're kind of ignoring the followers in the equation, and we need to really put more attention on the followers. And I kind of echoed that, and I said, we need to really do this. And I think I said the term, we need to put our money where our mouth is. We say the followers are important, but we don't really pay them much mind. So fast forward a few years, and in the back of my head, I kept thinking, gosh, be great to do a conference on followership, but I'm not sure how to approach that. And Jean Lippman-Blumen said, I want you to meet someone. I had not met Ira Chaliff. And he was here in Claremont. And so we got together. And the first question he asked me is, I'd like to put on a conference on followership. And I said, hey, I have funding. We have an annual conference here. And I said, let's do it. And I think Ira always says that was the easiest ask he ever made. But it was kind of in the back of my mind. And what we did at that conference is we went and got the people who I think were really seriously studying followership, although they may not have used that term. Although like Joe Rost was here and he had actually used that term and drawn our attention to the need to study followers. But we looked at other things too. We looked at, we had an expert here on whistleblowing, and he talked about what whistleblowers go through. And you can see a lot of this in the book. We had an expert on Stanley Milgram and his famous shock experiments, obedience. And what he focused on was the minority of people who could stand up to the experimenter and not, inflict pain on someone else. And so all of these areas, and then of course, Jean Lippman-Blumen with her work on toxic leadership, and she has a book on toxic leadership. And it really is a book on why do followers support toxic leaders, which I think is a really big, important question for today. So we brought all of that together and produced the book, The Art of Followership. And I think that really has helped launch more attention to the area of followers and followership.
I love that this came out of a great conversation, as so many wonderful things do. And it's very on brand, of course, leading and following as a conversation.
Yeah.
But I want to pick up on your comment about the term itself, follower or followership. You mentioned that you were looking at whistleblowing and perhaps some other adjacent terms at that first conference. I wonder if you could say a bit more about how the word followership was received at that time.
Yeah, well, this was really interesting because the conference went over several days, and we had everybody here. Barbara Kellerman was here, and my good friend Georgia Sorensen, and leadership scholars, and people who were actually looking at followership. And the first day of the conference, people started saying, "We don't like that term. We don't like that term follower," and there were suggestions of replacement terms, better terms. And I think Gene Lippman-Blumen, for example, said, well, what about collaborators? And I said, I don't like the tone of that. Well, Joe Rost, who had promoted followers and the study of followership, got up at lunch and said, I'm tired of the term. And he actually later wrote about that. And I know Ira looked at me and went, wow, this is derailing where we're trying to go. So I think I stood up, being the host of the conference, and I said, let's not quibble today and through this conference about what to call it. And let's just go with that terminology, because that's the name of the conference. And so, and I think we had some discussions kind of offline about this. And I sort of said, I think if we just keep using the term, it'll become more acceptable. I mean, and that's part of the way, phrases and terminology comes about. Is it just, if it's used a lot, I took that, if we build it, they will come, if we use it, then. And what I have noticed in the past, 18 years, is that in the research literature and among scholars in leadership, follower is now the accepted term. And if you go back, you think of what was the term when they didn't use leader, they used manager subordinate in organizational work, right? And subordinate has a negative connotation. Well, follower had that negative connotation, and I think it still does to a certain extent. But I think among scholars, it's more legitimized. And I think they understand, okay, what leaders have followers. And so it's okay to talk about the followers. So I think things are changing. In the popular world, everybody wants to be a leader. Nobody wants to be a follower. Followers are, there's the stereotypes and all that. So we still have to deal with all of that. But I think among, scholars, among practitioners who are savvy, the term follower is much more accepted.
That's great to hear. I also see the word followership more and more popping up in my LinkedIn feed, whether it's a business context or a research context. So I take your point about part of this being just about familiarity and perhaps attaching a new meaning to the term the more people use it. And at the same time, I noticed that even after all these years, there's still a strong resistance to the word followership, almost a kind of cringe reaction. And because you have a psychology background as well, I wonder if you have any insights for us about that. Do you think this is just a lingering association with the word, or do you think there might be something deeper going on here?
Yeah, I think it's more the traditional thinking, and I think it's related to what Jim Mindel called the romance of leadership. That we put leaders on a pedestal, and actually, my former colleague Susan Murphy and Nurjan Ansari, they did a really interesting study, which I think talks about this issue about how leader-centric we are in the West. So they did a study with our students here, and then Nurjan did the same study in Turkey with those students. And it was a really simple scenario study. Here's a situation, leaders in a team, and they're working together, and they succeed or they fail. And then what the participants had to do was they had to say, well, how much of the credit or how much of the blame in the failure situation was due to the leader and how much due to the team members. And what they found was a big difference. In the U.S., they gave the lion's share of the credit and the blame to the leader. And in Turkey, which is a much more collectivistic country, they saw less of the leader cause, right, and more of gave more credit to the team or more blame to the team members. Being in the U.S., there's this leader centrism, and followers are seen as passive, and followers are seen as lower status. And, so I think that it still persists to some degree. It's changing, and I'm hoping that we can change that by, legitimizing the term. The other thing, kind of approaching this as a social psychologist, I guess I never had personally that negative connotation. In sociology and social psychology, groups and collectives, people play roles. And so one role is leader, and the other role you might call regular member. And you might call it follower too, but I think in the terminology, it's regular member. And they're just seen as roles that people play. And so there isn't that benefit or positive connotation given to leader. It's just another role. And if you think about it in a jury or something like that, you bring a bunch of people together and someone becomes still call it the foreman, but I think they're starting to change it to four-person, which makes a lot of sense. In fact, I was watching a show and the first time I heard them say four-person, but they're really not a leader. I mean, they're just nominally playing a role of kind of keeping things going. So, when we put the term leader on something in our Western culture, we sort of raise it up and kind of put it on a pedestal. And I think that leads to then the follower being downgraded. And we just need to change that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There is a huge difference between attaching your whole identity to that label, leader or follower, whatever that label might mean to you, versus seeing it as a practical function that you're performing temporarily. I'd like to move forward in history a bit to the present day. What are some interesting questions that are arising now around followership that you would like to see the followership community explore, or perhaps that you see an opportunity for us to explore in the coming years?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that's very clear is we've studied leaders a lot. We know a lot about the qualities of leaders, and we're in an election year right now, and so you hear them talking about things like the quality of their character. Empathy is coming in, which is a term you didn't often hear from traditional leaders, but we're hearing, are they empathic? Do they care? Compassion. And so we hear a lot about leader qualities, but we don't hear much about follower qualities. So I think what we need to do, and as scholars, I think Mary Yulbein sort of coined the term, reverse the lens. And we need to understand followers and the follower role and follower behavior in the same depth that we understand about leaders and leadership and leader behavior. So I think that's really critical. Now, Mary and others have argued, well, that's not enough. And that's just sort of, flipping the script. And we need to go beyond that. And so clearly we need to look at leadership as something that leaders and followers co-create in a particular context for a particular reason. We want to avoid the mistakes of the past by focusing too much on just the leader, which is the historical perspective, and not just focus only on the follower. But we do need to do that, reversing the lens, so that we can understand what followers do. I mean, we don't really have that same breadth and depth of information that we have about leader behavior, about follower behavior. So that's one thing. I think the other thing, and a lot of it, I'm a scholar, so I think about what are my lessons for scholars, or what would I like them to do. And I think the other thing too is in leadership, much of the published work, the published research is very quantitative. But I think we need to have some more qualitative research, because to understand follower behavior, it's kind of a wide open question. We don't want to just start defining the behavior in quantitative terms. So I think we really need to move into, qualitative methodology. Another thing, and this is something I got interested in with some folks at one of our local business schools, is we started talking about, and this is kind of an interesting thing, Sharna. When we talk about the impact of leadership, we're always measuring follower outcomes, right? So if you're leading a team and you want to measure performance or productivity, using these organizational terms, what do we measure? Well, what did the team put out? What was their output? Did they reach their goals? And that's really about the followers. And if we want to evaluate the leader's success or the success of the leadership effort, we ask the followers, did the leader do a good job? Right? I mean, that's very common, right? And so all of the outcomes really focus on what followers think, what followers do, and the leader's left out of the equation, right? And so what we did was we thought about it in different ways, and we said, well, what happens if you bring leaders back into the picture of the outcomes? And we created something we called shared leader follower outcomes. And, so for example, in traditional thinking, you ask the followers, are you satisfied with your supervisor? Are you satisfied with the quality of the leadership in this organization? And we know if people get dissatisfied, they'll tend to leave the organization, right? Most people, as they say, they leave their bosses, not their jobs. And what we said, well, what will happen if we change that measurement from sort of satisfaction to, we use the term chemistry. Is there chemistry between the leaders and the followers? When we think about performance outcomes, we use the term synergy. Do leaders add to what the team could produce, the team of followers could produce on their own? Or does the leader get in the way? Does the leader inhibit? So we bring the leader back into the picture looking at these outcomes. So that, that's kind of a fun project that we've been focusing on. But I think it points to how much we've been so leader-centric in our thinking and dividing leaders and followers when leadership is really something that they do together collaboratively.
I am pretty excited about this shared leader follower outcome model, probably because it reminds me so much of dance and how I think about the social dance relationship. You're using these marvelous terms like chemistry and synergy. It's very similar. And correct me if I am wrong, but it sounds like when you reverse the lens, and I guess you're looking through both lenses is what you're doing, it actually changes the entire research question.
Yeah, it absolutely does.
Ron, would you speak to that a bit more? Because I think it's quite a massive paradigm shift, maybe far bigger than it may initially seem, especially in terms of its consequences for how we think about how any type of group effort happens.
So I think the traditional way is to say, well, the leader does something and the followers, the leader motivates or inspires and the followers perform. And we're saying it doesn't really work like that, right? It's a collaboration that goes on. And we know sometimes leaders do get in the way. They inhibit, that they work at cross purposes, or they limit what the team can do. If we talk about innovation, we know that, listening to the followers, listening to the team members is going to lead to greater innovation. And that's the whole issue about diversity and inclusion, diversity of opinions, including people, including their perspectives. And that leads to creativity. It leads to, better outcomes. So this is all kind of there. But I think what happens is we haven't really focused very much on the role of the followers.
Yeah, Ron, this might be too early to ask, but do you have any examples of this kind of research to kind of make it a little bit more like real world?
So let me tell you one of the things that we're working on right now, and this is our reversing the lens. And so I'm calling the project the anatomy of followership, that we don't really even understand, first, what do followers do? I mean, so if you go back, and I've been around doing this a long time, right? But if you go back to the early management literature, there was a guy named Mintzberg, and Mintzberg did this sort of qualitative stuff where he followed managers around to see what they did. And this was the very early days. In fact, they didn't even use the term leader or leadership. They talked about managers and management. And he noticed that they spent a lot of time communicating, right? They're writing memos, they're talking to the team, that kind of thing. We want to do the same thing with followers, and we want to sort of follow them around and say, well, what do you do? How do you spend your day? So that's kind of like almost like a diary kind of approach. And all this stuff is very, very qualitative. The other thing is, how do followers think about their own behavior? So many of them may not have follower identities to speak of. So what is their identity? And I think I'm working with Kevin Lowe, who's a leadership scholar, and we said, well, maybe we can't even use that term because people don't understand it. And so we started something we called sort of implicit peer theory. How do you think about the other people in your team? Then the idea is that we eventually bring that to how do you think about your own role? And not use the term follower necessarily because of the potentially pejorative connotation of follower, right? So a safer thing would be to say, what do you think of your peers? What do you think of yourself as a team member? And I think I said this at the Global Followership Conference a couple of years ago, is there's probably a lot in the team literature that will help inform our knowledge of followers because that's a personal identification, right? I'm a member of a team or I'm not a member of it. And so I think that there's a lot there that's probably been studied by those team researchers that would provide some value to us. So I think, if you look at those folks, the practitioners who work with teams, they understand team dynamics. They understand what leaders need to do to sort of facilitate team dynamics. I don't think there's as much attention given to what do the team members do? How do they think? How do they view their role? And how that impacts outcomes.
I can see how this is a very practical, smart strategy because there is still a bit of a default, almost unconscious maybe, to think of yourself as less than the named leader of the group, whatever the group is. And I'm referring to US context here. But if you start a reflection process through the side door almost by asking someone about their peers and then themselves with this more neutral label of member, I wonder if that just begins to diminish the perceived power differential just by virtue of inviting people to observe one another and themselves. In other words, the reflection itself shifts the focus away from the leader and toward everyone else in the group without overtly announcing that's what's happening. And then once the focus has shifted, I imagine people start to see very different things.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's really the case. And from a practitioner perspective, you need to get people to focus on, like what they're doing and how they define themselves. And if you talk about Ira's work with the courageous follower, for example, I don't think that people think about, that it's part of my job to have the courage to, when I need to, stand up to my leader, or to use the other part of the subtitle of his book, to stand up for your leader. How can you facilitate what your leader's trying to do if you believe in what they're doing? And I think by sort of shining a light on what are good follower behaviors to get a particular outcome, it's going to help that person to engage in those kinds of behaviors. If you talk about you've really got to stop your leader, I think everybody, lots of followers just say that's dangerous, and if I do that, I'm going to have negative outcomes. And I think by focusing on, well, what does it mean to be a courageous follower, to stand up and, for the good of the collective, we shouldn't be going down this path. By focusing on that, you're going to encourage and enable people to do the right thing, to be able to stand up to the leader and say, and a lot of times it's minor. It's just, boss, it would be better if we did it this way rather than that way. But people are afraid to share that because of that romance of leader. The leader is more knowledgeable. He or she must know what they're doing, right? And, I think by focusing on follower identity and the role of followers, you start to change that a little bit. People just don't default to, the leader knows best.
Yeah, absolutely. And so important to do that in a lot of different contexts. I have a funny, not funny story from my previous life as a tango instructor. Here's what happened just over and over again. I think it kind of illustrates the point. And this is a gendered kind of situation, right? So mostly the students I'm going to describe right now are women. So women generally perform the follower role, right, in a social dance context, although that, is changing to a certain extent. And I can't tell you how many, I think it's probably hundreds or thousands, of women who kind of passed through my classes over a period of 10, 15 years who just came in and were like, well, I'm uncomfortable, but I want to do what my leader is asking. Or they would complain that their shoulder hurt, or about not knowing what to do, or feeling off balance. And, when I would say something which, for me sounded really simple, like, well, move your arm into a different position, or step in a way that's comfortable to you, or, wait until you know what to do before you move, hold your ground. All of which are great metaphors for, I think, organizations or workplaces. This was often like an astonishing thing. And these are women who were CEOs and very successful, many of them in other realms. But when they entered the dance sphere, something happened and they took on this different stereotypical role. But, on the bright side, all I had to do was say, there's a different way you can play this role. You can actually choose how you want to be in partnership with this person. You can say no, you can slow yourself down, you can adjust your arm position, you can step differently. And, for most of the time, once I kind of said, here's another opportunity, there's another way you can do this, you can decide, it was like a revelation, and it vastly improved their dancing. It vastly improved, the whole social experience, for everyone, because they were just now more active and making a choice.
Yeah. I think our work on outcomes too relates to dance, and you can probably see this. So synergy would be, in a dance, the traditional view would be, in the gendered situation, did the woman dancer follow the lead of the male dancer, right? And how good was that? Well, synergy would be, together, did they produce something that was better than just one person leading and another person following? One of the other leader-follower outcomes is we talk about in organizational behavior. We say, well, do people were they absent, and why were they absent? Are they calling in sick because they hate their job, but they're really not sick? So we talk about that sort of voluntary absenteeism and turnover. And we said, well, attendance is a big outcome in organizational behavior. But what about, do you even show up ready to work? And we called it presence. Are you there ready to perform your job? And is the leader there ready to perform his or her job to enable the team to do their job, to work with the team? And I think you could talk about dancers coming to the dance with or without presence. Are you present? Are you ready to perform? Are you mentally prepared? And that's kind of like that outcome that we think is so important, because it's simple to say, oh, somebody's absent, and they're probably absent because they don't want to be here. But are they mentally prepared to come to work? Because people could come to work and snooze all day, right? And not do anything. And that measure would be imprecise, because you'd say, well, the person was here. Well, they didn't do any work, right?
Totally, 100%. And it's such a low bar in a dance context to evaluate success by asking a question like, did the woman perform the step the man asked her to do? Not only does it sound kind of brutish and mechanical, but it leaves out all of the outcomes that men and women claim matter to them. Was the dance connected? Was the dance musical? Are we moving smoothly together? Are we creating something together? Are we enjoying ourselves?
Yeah, but we use that. Historically, we've used that for leaders and followers. The leader pushed the lever and the follower did the deed, right? It's really interesting, because if you look at some of the leadership theories, you can tell the difference, I'll give you an example. Fiedler's theory, right? Everybody thinks of Fiedler's theory as sort of outdated. But one of the things he talks about, he says, okay, well, leaders have these sort of styles. They either focus more on tasks or they focus more on relationships, and they kind of can't help themselves. But then his other elements of his theory is, do the followers really accept the leader? and that's going to affect the outcome. And what's the structure of what's the context? And we know that context is incredibly important. So he actually had a lot of foresight in that theory that sounds kind of archaic now, but he's talking about, what do the leaders think? What do the followers think? What's the situation? How much power does the leader have? Because in some instances, the leader doesn't have a lot of power. In other instances, they have tremendous power. And so he puts all that into the equation. So I often, have my students go back and say, well, you think this thing is old and outdated because it has old terminology. But if you peel back the layers, you can see that there's, input of followers, input of leaders, input of the situation or the context. So there is, in the leadership literature, there's a lot there about the quality of the leader-follower relationship.
I also now wonder what we might find that's already there if we start looking through the followership lens rather than the leadership lens. Although I must say I am still intrigued by the potential emerging synergy theory by Dr. Ron Riggio and colleagues. Yeah. So I will definitely be keeping my eye on that. Ron, what other followership projects are you excited about right now?
Yeah, well, so I mentioned the anatomy of followership study, or the initiative that we're doing. One of the things I'm working with Mikey Kugler, who I actually met at the Global Followership Conference a couple of years ago, and she's done some terrific work with qualitative data analysis, and she kind of got us excited about a methodology called story completion. And so we're using that methodology to try to diagnose, what do followers do? So we have these stories, Fred is working his job and here's a situation, complete the story. And so it's almost like a little projective test of, do they project into that follower behavior? And then we'll go through and code those behaviors to figure out, how do people think about followers and followership? With Kevin Lowe, and we've got to pick this up, but our implicit peer theory. So it's really interesting. If you go back to Fiedler's theory, he has a measure called the least preferred coworker, but he also had a measure called the most preferred coworker. And he didn't do much with that most preferred coworker measure. But we've started using that to relate it to our implicit peer theory. And what that implicit peer theory is saying is, what do we look for in a peer, in a coworker? Because if I'm looking for somebody who takes initiative, who's creative, or who's industrious or conscientious, that may say something about what I value in my own follower behavior. If I'm looking at my co-follower and saying, this is my ideal co-follower, there may be some clues in there for what ideal follower behavior looks like. So we're kind of approaching it from two ends. We're asking, we're doing it in multiple ways. We're saying, what do you do when you follow? But we're not using that term. We're asking them, here's a situation, a story. What should the follower do in your mind? And then we're saying, well, what are you looking for in another follower to be a partner, to be a peer on a work team? And so from that, we're trying to capture in multiple ways what follower behavior looks like. So that's one of the things I'm kind of excited about.
Well, I really appreciate how you've been sifting through the leadership literature, sometimes reinterpreting what's there or using concepts in different ways, and in some cases, completely filling in the missing perspective of followership where it's been overlooked.
See, I think there's a thing in social psychology called the fundamental attribution error. And the fundamental attribution error is when we see something, we see an outcome, and what we're looking at then becomes our sense of cause. And so this is what's happened with the leadership literature. So a team is fantastically successful. So think of a sports team, right? So the sports team is fantastically successful. They had a great year. And the attribution, the fundamental attribution error is to look for the cause of that. And then you go, oh, it's the coach, And so now or the team has a really terrible year and you go, oh, it must be the good coach or the bad coaching, fire the coach.
Yes, I think many times it's a type of unconscious leader bias that's showing up there, and we don't even realize it. The same thing, of course, happens in social dance. It's often the leader who gets credit or the blame for whatever the couple has done together. And I'll tell you another funny, not funny story about attribution error and leader bias. I taught for a long time by myself or with female assistants. And when I did that, I was demonstrating the leadership role in class, wearing leader shoes, literally embodying the leader. Then at a certain point, I started teaching with a male partner, and I switched to demonstrating the follower role, wearing follower shoes, high heels. Guess what happened? The students, and keep in mind, these were in many cases the same students, right, who already knew me. They started asking my partner all the questions, giving my partner all their attention. It was as if my value as an educator had suddenly been downgraded because of my role, my followership role. But we will leave the tango world for now. And Ron, I don't think this interview would be complete if I didn't ask you about the next followership conference, which will be back at Claremont McKenna in May 2025. And you and I are serving as this next conference's co-chairs together. So, what do you hope to see at this next gathering? And what are you most looking forward to?
Yeah. So one of the things that I really want to do is I want to work to get some more scholars there, to have the scholars get immersed in the followership community so that they can understand this. I want there to be synergy, to be interaction between scholars and practitioners so that we can learn from each other. I'm also hoping that, and I think we've talked about a little bit about this in terms of the theme, is how do we move things forward? How do we move the sort of focus on followers, the focus on followership? How do we move that forward in an accelerated way, right? How can we get a lot? And I'm hoping that we'll have some conversations around that. And then I think too, we want to not forget that we have to look at the entire system. And so when we talk about followers and followership, we need to say, well, where does the leader fit in? And then where does the situation, where does the context fit in? So I think that we're really talking about, sort of expanding our thinking, expanding our relationships so that we're not, siloing. I think the big problem that occurs in much of the work is people silo and they say, well, I'm primarily a practitioner, so I don't have much to learn from the scholars, or the scholars say, oh, we're doing scholarly stuff, and what do the practitioners have to offer? They all have something to offer, and I think we need to really bring this community together of people with different perspectives and get some synergy, to use our term.
Yeah, absolutely. Now you've got me thinking about a potential future collaboration studying tango dancers. Maybe I'll find some scholarly partners for that next year. Thank you so much, Ron. It's been a pleasure. Your insights, as always, are inspiring and mind expanding, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Well, I'm looking forward to co-chairing and working on the followership conference, and I hope lots of your listeners will attend.
You have been listening to the Lead and Follow podcast. Special thanks to Glover Gill for composing our music, and a huge thank you to all of you who support the show. It really means a lot. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend or consider joining the Lead and Follow fan club for as little as $3 a month. There's a link at the bottom of the show notes.